Hello and welcome to cold, wintry Switzerland, Zurich, the heart of blockchain nation. We had a lot of questions on Reddit, which we collected, and today I have our PR manager, Rina, with me, who's going to help me to guide you through all those questions. I'm delighted about being here today. I'm delighted about communicating again. And I think, we're going to go through, a whole journey of maybe an hour even. So, buckle your seats and let's get running.
So one of our top questions was around the origin of the Cardano Triad. And so we're kind of looking back as to why and how Emergo, IOHK and the Cardano Foundation came into being.
Great question. So I might be the wrong person to basically ask that question to, as I was not there. However, how it happened and what actually happened and the design principles are very clear. When you want to do something as grand as changing the world and building a trinity of building operational capacities to do that, you need different cultures, you need different operational architecture, and you need different mindsets. So the first thing you need when you take a step backward and look at what we learned from the blockchain 1.0 and 2.0 was we needed interoperability, scalability, and sustainability. So the idea was to take a step backward and have an academic, scientific, rigid approach. And that meant that an entity needed to be formed which has access to academic, an army of scientists who really can shape the foundational research, and an army of engineers who can take that research and apply that to code. And that is what IOG or IOHK has been doing. And they've been doing an amazing job in shipping that and doing that translation into the foundational layer of the Cardano blockchain. So what you also need is you need commercialization, education, and launch pads. And that's the three areas which Emergo is responsible for, and where they've been really driving that forward in terms of how do we actually get scalable education, commercialization on the Cardano blockchain, but also around these launch pads and how these launch pads is going to put power into the ecosystem and into the builders on the platform.
And how do we think how do the organizations interact? So kind of on a day-to-day basis, how do you interact with each other? That's kind of one of the questions as well. And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, maybe before we come to that question, we can speak about a little bit around what the foundation, so the last entity. So when you think about it, on the journey from, let's say, a federated network all the way to a distributed, decentralized network, you need different things at different stages. And in the last 14 months, we are now the most decentralized blockchain in the world. And if you look at what the stake pool operators has actually achieved and how the whole governance and the infrastructure around that is already running, I think we can be very proud. The Cardano Foundation's role in this as the third entity in the Trinity is really to bring some clarity around three questions. The first one is we are asking people to trust a database, a decentralized database which they don't control, and we want them to trust that with their enterprises and their business critical and life critical applications. If it's a hospital, for instance, we are asking them to trust that it's so predictable that whatever happens, whatever oversight they work under, that an oversight can be done, an audit can be done. And last but not least, we ask them also to say, what are the odds that this blockchain as it is today will also exist in the generations to come. And that's one of the roles the Cardano Foundation really has. It's about being this custodian of an ecosystem who is in the end is a self-running, self-governing entity. And we will probably be one of the last parts of the Trinity standing in the function as we hold. So you'll see that more entities will come together. So it will be much more than a Trinity. The Emergo and IOHK was changed slight direction based on the maturity of the ecosystem, but they will always be involved and they will just, add different values at different stages of the maturity.
Could you maybe go into a little bit more detail as to why the foundation is based in Switzerland?
Sure. So why Switzerland? Switzerland is one of those questions we get a lot of questions on. And I think in my opening, I was using words like blockchain nation and so forth. So we have to be really brutally honest on it and say that, decentralization and distribution of governance and permissionless blockchains is questioning the status quo. It's basically asking regulators and asking enterprises to have a different perception of what enterprise-grade security architecture means, but also what the legal system actually should do. And if you look at the legal system today, it's very much around, there needs to be a entity or there needs to be a person who can be held liable to certain actions according to the social norms and the regulatory standard in any given country. So what we have in Switzerland, which is amazing, is that we have a very stable macroeconomic landscape. Switzerland has been very early in adopting blockchain, and they've been doing that by bringing clarity from a regulatory perspective of what is blockchain, what is decentralization, what kind of token classification exists, what does it need in terms of digital identity and so forth. And several changes and laws have been passed to ensure that this clarity keeps evolving. And that has brought a very large ecosystem into Switzerland, which is, besides this clarity, also one of the leading capital markets hubs of the world, specifically within asset management, but also within reinsurance and within other things. And as one of the, let's say the best use cases on a blockchain still to this day today is capital markets and banking. These things goes very well in together. Further to that, we have a very specific setup, which is called a Swiss foundation. It's a Swiss non-profit foundation. And that's a very interesting setup because it means that we don't have shareholders, we don't have a pressure towards a yield or earnings or something like you see in a normal company. It's really a protected setup in Switzerland, which also has a very high liability towards the board members and their actions. So we are a regulated entity. And that means that we can do certain things on the long haul. And it's a very good, let's say it has various points being associated with a blockchain, and a foundation fits very well together in terms of governance and how you issue governance and how you go on that road towards decentralization. So I think, I don't know if the audience and the blockchain citizens know this, but Switzerland was the second jurisdiction actually where the foundation found its home. So the first initial home was actually on the Isle of Man. And the Isle of Man at that time went a little bit of a similar approach. So they were thinking about, how do we attract blockchain businesses, fintech and all those things. And they did some changes, but the banks didn't follow up. So that means that there was regulatory clarity, but the banks didn't follow up with support. So the foundation actually ended up being not that operational because they couldn't get access to pay salaries and do certain things which you need to do as an operational company. And then the decision was then taken to move the foundation from the Isle of Man. It's not really a move, it's basically creating a new foundation because you can't move a foundation. It's a legal complex problem. But then it was, a new foundation was incorporated in Switzerland due to some of the reasons I told you before. And I think we can be very proud. There's a lot of blockchain foundations in Switzerland, but we have some of the best support from some of the largest banks in the world. And we have access to infrastructure, which a lot of other foundations simply don't have, due to the way we have set up, due to the way the architecture and the decentralization work, and due to the highly skilled people working in the foundation.
And on that then, I suppose, you've kind of touched on the Isle of Man as obviously it was a former place where we were, but are there other places that you think the foundation could find this kind of similar setup, or we could potentially move? This is one of the questions, but from what you've said there, Switzerland definitely seems like the best place for us, but just to kind of challenge back on that, is there somewhere that you think could be better?
So I just had the honor of being in Wyoming and crossing through Colorado, and I think Colorado and Wyoming has done amazing things around clarity and so forth. But we also saw the latest infrastructure bill which passed, right? So there is still a lot of, let's say, long-term unclarity about what's actually going to happen in the US. Some of the more smaller and more aggressive jurisdictions, to be honest, they won't be able to have the breadth and the reach which we can get out of Switzerland. I really like a couple of countries in Asia, but in Asia we have a whole different movement of power going on right now, which puts some risk if we think about, that this has to be a home for the next 10 to 20 years. I think we need to be agnostic, and we need to always evaluate if there's a place where we can help the ecosystem and we can move the Cardano blockchain forward and really take care of this resilience, reliability, and predictability problems. If we can do that out of another country, we should always be open for that. But right now, the best country, as I see it, is Switzerland.
Brilliant. And actually, I think that brings us nicely on to one of the other questions, which is actually around regulation. And kind of you touched on it there regarding the infrastructure bill in the US. But kind of how can the industry get out ahead of regulation, and kind of what can we do to put our best practices forward and kind of really, I suppose the industry can't stay unregulated forever. And so what do we need to do in this space?
Yeah. So I think there's a whole agenda of things we should do. So first and foremost, crypto and blockchain has become synonymous. And now we see this huge movement called DeFi. And DeFi is really upping the game. And in certain ways, it's amazing what DeFi has allowed us to do in Africa and doing microfinancing and allowing, people who don't have access to capital markets and doing liquidity formation outside of capital markets. But we can really start banking the unbanked through permissionless blockchains. And for instance, in Nigeria, you can get a P2P mortgage and stuff like that, which you are simply not able to do at those rates and those kind of security. And it's sustainable in the aspect of that, you can actually hedge your risk as a provider of the mortgages through the access of the blockchains. So I think a lot of really positive things has happened, but this kind of, the lack of differentiation among, what is crypto, what is DeFi, what is lending, what is blockchain, it really needs to happen. And I think as an industry, we need to come together, specifically the public permissionless blockchains needs to come together and be much better in articulating what is what and how does it look from a regulatory perspective. So we need to start talking the regulatory language together instead of fighting alone. We need to come together and build some standards about, if we're going to have, the travel rule, or if we're going to have KYC and AML, which by the way is built into Cardano, so it's really not a big thing to do that. We always envisioned to have that. What does that actually look like, and how do you document that? And how do you ensure interoperability between maybe a centralized system and a public permissionless blockchain? The blockchains is all about root of trust, and I think that's amazing. And you probably have the best root of trust in any permissionless blockchain with Cardano today. So how do we ensure that there's added value becomes obvious for the regulators? So it's about education, it's about standards, and it's about the industry coming together, working together, collaborative, instead of kind of fighting or not at least sharing resources to bring this clarity out, specifically to the large jurisdictions who is setting the tone and the pace and the trend.
And actually on that, I think you've hit in a really good point is around the education of kind of the people outside of the crypto blockchain space. And I suppose, there's going to be a wide audience of people looking at this. And so if someone in a bank is sitting down looking at this and they're like, what's the difference between crypto and blockchain? What would you say?
So I'm a banker and I'm an investment banker of trade. So I'll probably already zoom in on that specific bank. But the first thing I always say is that, hold on a second. So crypto is not just crypto. It's not the same as comparing euro dollar to dollar yen or to sterling or something like that. So first you need to actually look at what is the purpose of the asset, and not just the asset as a financial asset class. And in essence, crypto is an application who lies on a blockchain of some sort. And the second part you need to then look at is that some sort. What does that mean for your compliance department? And what does that mean for your strategy? And what does that mean in the end for the shareholders and the people who has control over the bank? And what people don't really understand is that they say, oh, crypto, we have maybe top 20 assets, which is trading, is a large volume, is changing maybe the power gap of who can issue a currency. And that's a very typical banker's view. It's about having a new kind of ISIN number, which the clients really likes. It brings stickiness, it brings a new way of alpha. But what I think the banks really need to understand is that it's most likely it's possible, we did a bit of math, you can build a bank with 52 smart contracts, 3 ledgers and 5 people. I still think you need some people to talk to, your clientele, but from an operational perspective, there's huge operational gains to be had to apply blockchain technology in the back end of banks. And you can change the business models and get access to new markets. I mean, this is a growth scenario. A bank can get access to 2 billion people they don't have access to today through blockchain, right? So this is about actually looking at the operating model as well as the asset class and really trying to figure out where is it the bank wants to position themselves. And I think what we saw, for instance, in the Philippines, where we've been working together with a bank there, they actually chose to start running a stake pool. And by running this stake pool, they actually get in-house knowledge in the IT department about what the blockchain can do. Plus the accounting department gets, a cash flow coming in, who is different than a normal cash flow. It's not a normal earnings or yield. It's a reward coming from a public blockchain, which forces them to have a VAT opinion and forces them to have an opinion about where does that lie. The treasury then have suddenly some ADA, which they need to do something about, which you don't normally have if you're just routing trades through the system. So are they going to sell those ADA, or are they going to use that for something like utility on chain? And then suddenly you kind of have a little bit of a self-fulfilling ecosystem growing in that bank, where you actually in-house in the bank are getting those very expensive resources who can answer the questions while you're actually going break even. And I think this is an amazing way of thinking about another avenue of how blockchain can enter capital markets or banking systems and learn and educate and bring change internally without actually costing any money.
Yeah, and actually I think we've actually touched on, the conversation has deviated a bit, and we've actually managed to cover some of the questions, one of which was kind of how can banks integrate Cardano into their staking model? And I think maybe if there's anything else that you kind of want to touch on that, maybe?
Oh yeah, so this obviously is a big question. So I think in one of the last videos we're speaking about why is it that we want to onboard 50 banks / mobile network operators / crypto fiat rails. And I would like to maybe go back to that one step. So for the foundation, it's extremely important that wherever you sit in the world, that you have access to buy and sell ADA, because this is the entryway to utility on-chain. So only by having some ADA or access to that, you can get access to this decentralized network of power, of community, of innovation, which gives you all of the values of a blockchain. If you build a business on the Cardano blockchain, I think it's our duty as the foundation to ensure that you also have avenues where you can sell some of that ADA, so you can have a fiat currency and you can buy food in the supermarket and so forth. Because adoption will not happen overnight. It will not be we wake up one morning and then you can do everything with a cryptocurrency. On the side of that, if you look into, let's say, inflation and inflation security, obviously, there is something around, where is cryptocurrencies trading today, but there is also a fact that we are going into a world of hyperinflation in many countries. Some countries already been there. Most of us are waking up to a reality where there is inflation. We see nation states are printing money as never before. And some of the cryptocurrencies, they have some very interesting monetary policies, which is set in stone, is in the Genesis block. And I think that allows you also to think differently about macroeconomic and economic specifically. So I'm a bit more of the Austrian school on that thought. But if you add staking on top of that, which is, I think people really get that wrong, right? But the reason we use staking is not to get some kind of reward, right? Is to actually show trust in the stake pool operators, which allows the consensus algorithm to work. But if you look at the cash flow pattern, how it actually works is that I will give you, if you'll be a staking pool, I will sign an IOU, so the money never leaves my account, or the ADA never leaves my account, right? It's the sign of trust who goes to you. You will never be able to take that away from me, but it's a sign of trust. Based on your operating model, a reward will be awarded to you from the network, the decentralized protocol, not from any of the Trinity, not from any individual incorporated entity, but really from the network. And a reward will be awarded to me because I showed you trust, coming directly from the protocol. And here staking is actually quite different from a protocol to protocol. And there's also something called proof of history or proof of relevance. And there's, of course, mining in the Bitcoin world. And there's all sorts of things. So I think what's interesting for a bank is to start having a look into some of these incentive models. Because some of those incentive models, they have distribution, they have different bookkeeping and risk profiles. And it gives the bank a good opportunity to do active guidance and advice and legal and bookkeeping advice. It lets the banker be a banker. So banking should not just be custody. It should also be advice. It should be your trusted, fellow who joins your family journey or joins your corporate journey and helps you to do certain things. And there the blockchain ecosystem is opening up totally new models for banks. Then another part is, when you look into how you do transparency in banking. I think a lot of banks, unfortunately, has lost a lot of trust, specifically to the blockchain citizens. And I think it would be amazing if we start looking at models where you have a Google Explorer, or let's call it a blockchain explorer, which could do queries on the balance sheet of a bank. So you had the ability to actually understand the operating model and the exposure the bank is doing. And I think if you had that kind of trusted data set, third-party trusted data set, you would be also more engaged as a shareholder to actually engage with your position you're holding potentially in a bank. So it can change the voting systems, and by changing the voting systems and the transparency, not just of the voting system, but the operating model, we will get different leaders in banks, and we will get banks who is working more towards social good, working more towards a environmentally good footprint, working more about, giving capital to startups and family companies who really needs it. And it will be a counter pressure towards some of the negative effects we saw from Basel III and other things.
And actually, we've touched on kind of what's possible for banks. And so now I think actually is a really good point to kind of look at what we're going to do for the next 24 months. And it's, again, one of our key questions is kind of what's our strategy for the next 24 months? What's the Cardano Foundation going to do? Can you give us that in a few lines?
No, in a few lines. Amazing. So essentially, we're going to form different divisions and departments who is aligned with the strategy presentation we already published several months ago. And the first one is we are going to form a department which we really call Regulated Financial Institutions and Exchanges. As you know, we're already supporting quite a few regulated entities around the world in terms of technical support. And we have a large demand of more support. But this department is really focusing on, as I said before, ensuring that we can have access to the decentralized blockchain wherever you are in the world, in the, let's say, regulatory environment you act and live in today. There's also a part of a compliance procedure in there and so forth. The other part is when we think about when you look at the Cardano blockchain, it is enterprise grade. It's the most solid blockchain you find out there. But if you are in the world of today and you want to connect to this world, you're actually lacking some infrastructure. So we're going to form a technology team who's going to build a new version of Ledger Sync, or what we love to call in our community DB Sync, because we've seen that one of the largest requests we have from exchanges and banks and enterprises is that the database sync functionality can be out of sync for a very long time. And we've seen that we can decrease that quite a lot. So we're going to do several products around that to ensure that as a business, you have the ability to parcel the blockchain in different ways to get value out of that. That will then also allow us to do a Cardano Explorer. Also, again, open source. So everything we do here will be open source. It will be reference implications. It will be on our developer portal, but it will also be on GitHub, which will allow everybody to take inspiration of this, right, and do their own business models. But the reason we want to do a Cardano Explorer is because we have some actors in the world, or some stakeholders, or some community which we're not servicing today. And those are very much regulators, it's accountants, it's auditors, it's a little bit the boring world. And what they need is they need a Cardano Explorer which accurately shows them the cash flow patterns, where is things moving and from which entities they're moving. Plus that we have enterprises, pharma life science companies and so on, who's actively looking at implementing on Cardano. And they are asking different questions than you would do if you're looking for a P2P transaction of ADA. They're asking, when we're doing metadata or when we are adding a smart contract through the Plutus application backend or whatever that is, when we're adding that to the blockchain, how can we ensure that we see the data and we see the root of trust and we see where these added value actually comes in if you want to do, for instance, insulin vials on the blockchain, that you can track that in a way who actually incorporates into your backend. So obviously there's going to be APIs out of both of those. Further to that, we're going to build some automated, we call it community tools. So it's not so much community in terms of one individual person, but it's more about, we have about 150, 60 exchanges and banks we support technically today on the Cardano blockchain. And we need to have an ability to scale that. So us having an understanding if an exchange is down or a bank is down, that it gives us a flag in the system that we can proactively reach out to them and say, actually, you are probably down because of X, Y, and Z. Or we can say, we're coming a new hard fork combinator event. You need to upgrade your infrastructure. Otherwise, some of the businesses or some of the clients who rely on your infrastructure will not be able to get the services they expect. And we want to get to a place where this is more self-service. So this is just one example, right? But the ability to build, products which allows enterprises, exchanges, banks, and so forth to get a better service from the Cardano community as a whole is essential in terms of getting adoption. When you're building products, however, you also need some Q&A, and you need some cybersecurity, and you need some infrastructure. And while we have not built those products yet, we will still establish a Q&A team who also will then start looking at some of the stuff that the community, you, dear community, is building, but also some of the stuff other people are building, and trying to look at how do they play together. So when you take a module and you put that together with a wallet, and you put that together with an oracle to understand, the Q&A release mechanisms and the quality, and how those, basically the testing of how those things play together. And then we obviously, as soon as we start having our own products, we will then also do that on ours. So we know that the reference code on these things will be up to the expectations which you do expect from a Cardano entity to deliver. Further to this, we're also going to have some product owners who's going to look into the feedback of this new, let's say, these new builders on the Cardano blockchain. So what I'm essentially speaking about is digital identity. I'm speaking about metadata and supply chain, and a couple of other, let's say, more verticals where we're looking into places where we've proven through, for instance, our partnerships today and the reference applications we have today, that this already works. How do we scale that, but also how do we add to that? So one of the key things with digital identity is not just having a great digital identity on the Cardano blockchain like a Tala Prism, but also having the ability to port that into other identity solutions. So you can identify with solution A on Cardano blockchain, but another system accepts that, right? So really going into those verticals and ensuring that people have what they need to build, but also that we attract those infrastructure components to the Cardano ecosystem is some of the places we are very much looking forward in building in what we call the center of excellence.
So that is definitely more than a few lines, but that's okay, because I think it's really, really important to go into all of those details. I think another part of our roadmap and what's ahead is around the ambassador program. So maybe you could just give us maybe more than a few lines on this one, on what the update with the ambassador program is, or kind of where we stand and kind of what's happening.
Sure. So I think that the ambassador program is one of the most strategic, important tools we have in the toolbox in order for the Cardano community to flourish. And we see so much energy, and we see also an increasing maturity in that. So much that they're even forming their own entities, like sub-entities under the ambassador program. They are representing also the Cardano Foundation in certain work groups, because they're, they have a lot of knowledge and they have a lot of experience, and they understand what we do, and we cried out also a bit for help, because the ecosystem is probably the largest or second largest ecosystem in blockchain at all. So a lot of things are happening. But I think also what we need to do is, like we just did the other week, where we had the honor of having Ken Kodama-san from Imurgo, one of the original founders of Cardano, but also the CEO of Imurgo, joining the ambassador call and doing like a Q&A there. The ability for us to ensure that whoever is building on the Cardano blockchain, so right now it's the 3 companies plus 15, 16 other companies, right? That we have, some way of a curated entryway, that they have the ability to also interact with the ambassadors, and the ambassadors can ask questions and they can get insight in order for them to represent in their community groups and in their verticals out there. We are still on an explorative path. I think there's a lot to be done still. I still think that when you look back into what happened in blockchain, we have, let's call it bounty hunting, which is very famous in blockchain, the ability to crowdsource work, right? The gig economy. And there we've probably not been as good as we could be, but we need to open much more up for that everybody has the ability to translate blocks and so on. And we still have the ability through curation, for instance, through ambassadors and moderators, that they can curate some of that. And on the other hand, the evangelism. So really, the people who truly believe that Cardano can be a part of really changing the systems of the world, which it can be, who's willing to go through, war and blood and walls to go into the right stakeholders and represent the Cardano community, not just the foundation, but the community in these closed circles, and really talk about that from their perspective and their experience. And I think, we can go even further there. And I think, what we are seeing is just the start, but it's an iterative journey, which we're also looking very much forward to doing with the ambassadors together. And
can you give a little bit of an update on what you discussed on the call, actually, if possible?
Sure. So it was a call. This was the specific Imurgo call. And Ken Kodama-san and Murasaki-san, they basically explained the roadmap of Imurgo. They also answered questions around Yoroi. They answered questions around the investment strategy, so these launch pads, as I spoke about earlier. They were talking a lot about who will they invest in and why will they invest and what are they going to do around education and how is their hybrid education program actually looking and how that ties into this launch pads that they basically are aiming at, getting, several thousand developers in. And obviously, how we work in a decentralized ecosystem is that we are not tied together contractually and so forth. So I think a part of the role of the foundation is also to seek out and ensure that we get this alignment and we get this knowledge, we get collaboration, we get community, we get alignment between entities. And I think it was a great call and was there were so many questions and I think that was very positive.
Yeah, there was a lot of questions. It was really, really engaging. I was on it myself. I think then this leads nicely into the next question, which is around support for developers regarding smart contracts. Can you maybe give us a little bit of an overview of that as well?
Sure. So as you know, the strategy from the Cardano ecosystem is that there's 5 entry ways into writing smart contracts. So you don't need to necessarily be a born Haskell developer, right? But we actually have the opportunity to also through an EVM or even port Solidity and other things into it. So we're really working on those 5 entry barriers. How we think about it as from the foundation side is that our key tool at the moment is our developer portal. So we're really striving at ensuring that the developer portal keeps growing and keeps also enhancing and becomes much more a little bit of a, let's say, an interactive Git exchange, where we also have the ability to not just share reference code, but also share other projects and curated ideas, but also maybe in the future have the ability to have people in the community interacting with coders who needs a bug fixing and so forth. But I do still think that we have to be very much aware of that. I mean, we only had smart contracts since, a little bit close to 2 months now, right? And we still need much more libraries and we call it the Plutus application backends to really evolve. But we already have, as I said before, we have, business models who circumventing the Plutus application backend and building their own. I mean, smart contracts are here already today. So this is just a maturity game. And through the Plutus Pioneer program, there were several thousand engineers who were educated in writing smart contracts. So that's the first drop. Now, as I said before, Imurgo is talking about getting the next batch of 3,000 through in the next 6 months. And we from our end is looking at how do we add to that by working together with universities and working together with education platforms. And we're trying to kind of find our way in how we can share the love of writing on an extended UTXO model, which is far superior from what we see in the account-based model, but also the architecture of how we separate the computing layer and the transaction layer is something where we really feel that it's not just about the programming language, it's also about understanding the architecture and understanding the superiority you can get out of the enterprise-grade blockchain.
University of Zurich is doing research on that. Can you delve a little bit more into that?
So this is work who's going to be started now or in the new year, right? So the people has to be hired and so forth. And the blockchain observatory already exists, but we're now adding the capability to basically grind or get data from the Cardano blockchain. We are today, the Cardano Foundation is not a part of setting the network parameters, right? That's all lying with IOG as it is today. However, we do see that Catalyst is growing up very fast. We do see that Catalyst now already have the ability to change the font size and change the scope, and we see that there's quite meaningful participation happening there. And I think what's really important is as we move along, is that we keep maturing not just the technical features of Catalyst, but also start involving ourselves as the foundation more in Catalyst, because this is going to be, it is already one of the main value drivers as we move towards Voltaire. But it's going to be very interesting to see how early and how late and so forth that these governance processes can be truly decentralized around protocol parameters.
And what does that involvement in Catalyst look like over the next year from the foundation side?
Yeah, that's a good question. Also because Catalyst already today is multiple things. We have Catalyst Swarm, we have Catalyst Circle, which is more formalized. we have the idea scale platform, we have the, let's say, the commercial product, called, Catalyst out of IoT. It's currently not sitting on the blockchain, it's sitting on a different blockchain setup, right? And I think as Catalyst matures and as we see it's being brought closer and closer to mainnet, we will increase our involvement from the foundation side. How we think about the strategy is if it's live on mainnet and is operating on mainnet and is connected to mainnet, that's where we start engaging. As we are not the builders of the actual blockchain, we are more the operators of the infrastructure and ensuring that you can connect to it and find this value and de-risk the interaction with the blockchain. That's where we come in, right? And therefore, you will see that the more Catalyst as a technical product emerges into Voltaire and the more meaningful participation we see from the community on Catalyst, the more the foundation will engage. And the closer it goes to mainnet, you will see an exponential interaction from the foundation side in Catalyst.
So, Fred, can you tell me a little bit more about the impact you think Catalyst will have?
Sure. So I think any amazing blockchain in the future and also in the present needs to be doing three things. It needs to take care of value and how you move value. It needs to have digital identity or an identity or identity solutions on it, and it has to have governance. And I think Catalyst in many ways is touching all of that, including also the sustainability of ecosystems and how you actually get the crowd to control. And already today we've seen that there's been multiple funds, which actually, where proposals came in through the idea scale platform. They got enhanced incredibly by the community, and there was voting on them, and money was basically been given to some of those projects. And some of those projects is moving really steady ahead. But it also gives us the opportunity for the community already today to take decisions over the future role and the future direction of the blockchain. So not only does it allow us to test and see different voting mechanisms. Today is a simple voting mechanism, but there will be multiple different voting mechanisms coming on. But it also allows this, governance and digital identity to play out, plus the direction. Secondly, it's going to be very interesting also when people really understand the utility you can have on a blockchain to see how the ecosystem plays along, specifically the ecosystem of custodians plays along. Because today is actually quite hard to vote if you're not in a community wallet like Ada Lite or Daedalus or Yoroi and so forth. So if you're in a, if you're through a bank or you're through an exchange, you might be very limited in participating in this decision mechanism. So I think one of the things we will do a lot on from the foundational side, where we already are very engaged in Catalyst, even though we are not sitting in the actual, the discussion forum, we are already working with a lot of these exchanges to allow the technology that you can do this voting, even though you do custody through a third party. So I think it's all about meaningful participation. It's all about decoupling the ability to take decisions, but also having different things like preferential voting and liquid voting. And I think we've already seen today the power of the community coming together, enhancing these proposals, getting funding, and start building and enhancing again and coming together, taking slightly different decisions. So this is already happening right now, and we will see a lot more.
What do you mean by liquid voting?
Yeah, so if we go back to the world of DeFi, which we very shortly visited, right? We have this notion of governance tokens, and we have the notion of that, certain, let's say, DeFi protocols that you can actually vote to put the interest rate in a certain project. So if you have a lending rate, you can come together and you can vote on that and so forth. However, most of these governance tokens, we haven't seen a lot of voting going on, but we saw a lot of people buying the governance tokens, and then we saw an appreciation of these governance tokens and people selling it and so forth. So they've been really looking much more as an asset class than we've been looking at what they were made to do, that you could participate in a governance system like a government on chain. And I think what's really important is that we don't go into the mistake of saying, let's say, one ADA, one vote, or one person, one vote. That's a very simple way of doing it. And if we look at democracy today, very typically, it's, if you're above 18 years old in a country and you live in a democracy, you have the ability to vote. However, in most countries, or I haven't actually been into a country where you could actually see or have proof that your vote ended in the ballot. So a lot of countries who has very low voter participation, this is also countries who have a very low trust to the government. So you hear a lot, well, I don't vote because I actually don't even know if my vote is counted, or I don't even trust that there are, governance and procedures around the actual procedure around that. And very often we also have systems where you vote on a politician, and the politician will be sitting there for 4 years, and he will be doing something completely different than what he promised you. So the concept of liquid voting is really a concept where if I task you to represent me in a complex decision, it could be a protocol parameter change or transaction fee change because I don't understand sufficient, and I give you certain boundary conditions of representing me, and I then see you going in a different direction, I can take down my vote and take it back, right? And then suddenly you don't have the mandate from me and maybe another 1,000 people, right? And that suddenly changes how much participation or what can you actually do in that voting poll or in that ballot. And I think that brings accountability back into voting. So not just the fact that I always know where my vote is and that is counted and is in the ballot, but also the fact that you can think about these different kinds of voting. So that's where I also have a little bit of a cry out to academia, right? I think it's very hard to get real data around, voting and voting mechanisms and so forth. But on blockchain right now, there's a evolution or nearly a revolution in voting happening in DeFi, but also on Cardano, specifically in Catalyst. And a lot of that data can be publicly grinded and publicly looked at, and you can look at, statistically what's happening and how much participation and what are people doing and so forth. So I think there's a lot of data where we can actually take some learnings, and maybe for the first time after the old Greeks who actually invented democracy, we can actually have maybe some data on a future way of doing governance on-chain. On Catalyst today is still kind of basic. We're working on the user experience, so it gets much easier. We're working on the ability that everybody who actually holds ADA have the ability to vote, even though they're through a third-party exchange or they're doing different things. But we need to get the voter increase or the participation up. We want to have way more, a larger participation in voting, like we also saw on the evolution on staking. Right now, we have over 70% of the Cardano ADA holders are staking, which shows a great trust in the network, right? Which is amazing. And we need to kind of work also on the voting as well, that we have as many as possible participating in the voting as well.
And kind of how are you going about, or how's the foundation going about achieving that, or trying to achieve that within the roadmap over the next 24 months?
Well, ability to vote, education about what you vote on, accountability towards the different catalyst funds and so forth, right? I think there's many ways of kind of looking at it, but I think the first way is that as blockchains becomes more and more mature and cryptocurrencies become much more mature, still knock on wood, there is some regulatory concerns around certain currencies, right? I think a large part of what we can do as the foundation will really be on the infrastructure part. So really ensuring that if you're holding your ADA with a bank, because that's the safest way and it gives you an ability to do accounting and taxes in a more, the user experience very often is just better, that the bank understands that they need to give you the ability to vote because it's important for you. So I think this kind of explanation of that ADA is not just an asset class, but it's an access to utility on chain, is somehow a derivative or becomes a derivative of the fact that the utility also means that you need to take, accountability and control that you actually participate in the ecosystem. The power of a public permissionless blockchain is not the technology stack. It is the people who believes in it. It is the root of trust, how powerful that is. And it's the architects of the future who is building and deploying life-critical and enterprise-critical infrastructure on that. And by that, they also take control over the system. And to take that control, they need to be able to vote. And they need to understand what they're voting on and need to have, guidance and help from some people in the start, at least, to ensure that when a direction is chosen, that it will be executed, or when money is deployed, that there's some accountability and bookkeeping around those money, and maybe some different epochs or sprints are being defined and so on. I think there's a lot of work still to be had there. And that's going to be a long haul. It's not just something in 12 months, but that's the whole direction. And we're building up and around that as well in the Cardano Foundation to allow us to take more ownership and support more there. So we don't want to control this, but we want to support the infrastructure around this development.
Yeah, and I think something we touched on there is the kind of the value proposition of blockchain and kind of the battle space of value capture. Can you just talk me through that side? Kind of when you think about it, kind of we have the heat map, we have kind of the 4 quadrants, and kind of explain to me what this actually is.
Sure. There's a war coming on blockchain, and there's a war raging in blockchain and crypto specifically right now. And unfortunately, a lot of people are very much focused on crypto, but they're not really looking behind that and what's actually happening. And to make it, a little bit, binary, but so everybody can understand that, what's really is happening is that the value proposition of blockchain is becoming more clear as it becomes of maturity. And that means the enterprises are now actually signing up and they want to do something on blockchain and they understand that value. But when we get to the finish line of the implementation, a lot of people actually choose to be on the south phase of that, and that's where the private blockchains exist. Because in the private blockchains, you kind of, from a procurement or from an old way, you seem to get the value out of it. But you actually don't, right? So what you will get is something who looks like a blockchain, but is controlled by some private nodes. Is potentially the mechanism of paying for that service would be software as a service and so forth. And that looks really nice because, from a regulatory perspective, you have control, you have clarity, right? You have predictability, you understand that this is an ecosystem who's controlled by, like centralized entities really, right? So you understand that will also exist in 5, 10, 20 years time because you can do contracts with these entities and so on. So in many ways, this is actually like a centralized technology stack with some added audit logs and some other things. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. There is, of course, quite a lot of value to be had down there, but it doesn't give you the true promise of a root of trust who is very different than what we see today. So when you're up in the north side of the equation where you have open and public permissionless blockchains, the openness allows the crowd to come together and innovate in a much more let's say, fruitful way. We've seen that also from academia. When you're sharing your research and sharing your data sets, you get, the crowd comes together and they do much more innovation than what we can do out of centralized entities. The other way, what you're getting up there is that you're kind of forced through a utility token to get access to this decentralized world. And that you're forced to kind of act with the utility token, put some regulatory pressure on you in terms of what does that really mean? Why can't I just pay some dollars or pay a monthly fee, but I'm actually paying per transaction? And that means that the more north you go, there is some questions who needs to be dealt with. And those questions is very much around the access. How do I get access? So through these utility tokens. And the other one is, what does true decentralization really mean? And what we see is that the regulatory community is coming together right now and is trying very hardly to define decentralization. So most likely what we're going to get is we're going to get a lot of innovation right now on these layer 0, layer 1 protocols, so the infrastructure protocols where the root of trust is big. And then as decentralization gets defined across board, it would nearly be impossible to make new of those. And that means that the innovation will happen in the side chains where you have these more like a P2P networks, which is then can be pushed to a much larger root of trust. And that means that we have an area right now of development where most likely in the future we won't get that many public permissionless blockchains other than what we have now, but you will then get a lot of innovation happening in the side chains around that. And that's because of that, it's so important right now that we build and we push and we lobby and we do everything we can to let this grow. But on the other side, we also educate what it means, because it does bring inclusivity, it brings power to a different entity, and it brings the promise of what blockchain originally was created to do. So I think it's our duty to really push that front at the moment, because the private side we will always get, and either in the side chains later we'll be able to utilize the development there. But as a community together, we need to really push the north part. And I think that's really important. So this is really talking about the war which is raging today around the clarity around tokens and token classifications and so on. And then the future will be when decentralization really gets defined. It's very hard for me to see how a community can come together without some kind of body in the early days to really agree on if I put time or material or if I put money on the table and we agree to do something who's going to change the world, we will nearly always start out by some kind of agreement within entities or within people on a journey to decentralization. And there I think, it's going to be very interesting to see how the regulation is going to move, but most likely will be in a place where decentralization will be defined and as a binary condition of 0 to 1. And then you need very big incentives to move from private to decentralized, because it means you're giving everything away, right? You're making everything you normally protect, you're giving that away due to a reason.
Yeah. And I think what we've kind of covered over the past while is the importance of community and the importance of working together, like even the fact that we have the triad, the importance of the ambassadors. And something that's come up as well in the questions was regarding the environment and how we plan to kind of address that. And something I suppose kind of we were chatting before was regarding the community coming together on standards. So maybe you can give a little bit more detail on that. We had a question on it, and I'm kind of paraphrasing, but you can have some good points on it.
Yeah, I think unfortunately there's a narrative out there right now that the blockchains are bad, because the two largest blockchain projects out there both are proof of work, and even though there's a difference in terms of the consensus and how it specifically works, right? In terms of the footprint, it is, the power consumption when the unit of scarcity is electricity and basically silicon, so CPUs, is optimizing towards the wrong factor. And the fact is just that Bitcoin has been around much longer than Cardano has, right? So many people who have learned what blockchain is, they actually look at Bitcoin, right? And they're saying, okay, we can't really work in an ESG or in a United Nations Sustainable Development Goals format, or we can't even have a business model where we're utilizing a public permissions blockchain if that means that the electricity consumption is so big and the silicon footprint is so horrible, huh? And I think in many ways, this is, is a raging discussion, and we probably will never get to a binary answer. But what's important for the Cardano Foundation and what's important for the Cardano project is that we are a very, very green blockchain. So when Charles, etc., went back to the drawing board and thought about how we basically solve some of those questions, we chose a different path, which is proof of stake, which is not about how much, the scarce economic resource is not power consumption or silicon, right? It's trust. And it's this staking environment. And that means that, we're probably using over 1 million times less electricity on the transaction level than Bitcoin is doing at the moment. On top of that, through Veritree and other initiatives, we've seen that the community is very willing to come together and actually ensure a circular economy in terms of our carbon footprint, but also ensure to show what does it mean to actually have a utility token on-chain with the regulatory parameters on-chain and not in a centralized aspect. And we've seen that there's a pressure in capital markets around, how do we make traditional capital markets products more green? And there I think the proof-of-stake blockchains has a phenomenal opportunity to be the transparency lens who can put transparency into some of these very centralized old-style models where they say, oh, I am green because I say I'm green. Or I'm green because I paid a consultancy company a lot of money to say I'm green, right? So if we start putting, let's say, the environmental accounting on a public permissionless blockchain and use the root of trust there, we actually see a system which could, bring transparency to the next level, but also not costing the world a lot because of the architecture I just explained. So I think we actually have a duty as an industry to come together and also put some standards down on ourselves, because we have some issues in terms of calculating sustainability, or calculating our footprints, because we are working through these decentralized node operators and we don't know exactly their infrastructure and so on. So I think we can come together and we can actually put some standards down and actually ensuring that we understand exactly what is our footprint. So down to the last dime, probably. There will be some assumptions, but let's do it in a scientific way. And on the other hand, we should be ensuring that people understand that you can actually use a very secure, very enterprise-grade blockchain to actually put a total different lens on this in terms of ESG, SDGs, and so on. And not forgetting also not the governance. As we spoke about Catalyst before, Catalyst is a governance on-chain. And when you look into the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of them is not just about, the environmental footprint in terms of green. It's also about how do we govern who has identities. There is goals in there defined, which is really talking about that everybody in a certain year needs to have access to a birth certificate and an identity. And we are one of those solutions. We can offer that people who don't have a birth certificate get an identity solution in the future. And identity solutions can lie with us and be much more robust than what we see in, unfortunately, small states, which has changing governments and changing, political landscape. So I think Cardano really fits into the whole palette of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But we have to do some work also in terms of education and standards to ensure that we can get it into a scientifically proven method on that.
Yeah, and I think actually on that, there was a question here. It's like, are there any plans to work with nation states and their ministries of education and environment? Do we have any information on that?
Yes, I do, but we will share that on a base-by-base basis or case-by-case basis. A lot of these are covered by NDAs, and there is a lot of uncertainty. And these things, they don't take a year or 3 months to do, right? This is things where it starts very small and it builds up. So this is, this takes 4 to 5 years to do. But most of you have heard around Ethiopia already and what we're doing there. They probably also heard about Georgia and what we're doing there. But there's several countries who's very interested in this, and we are, dedicating resources to it on a case-per-case basis. And I think it must be possible to have, fairly significant Cardano nation states in the next 10 years who is really, upgrading the infrastructure using Cardano in different places in the engine room to get a better experience, a better democracy, get more transparency also what the nation state doing, but also on the educational level.
I think we've covered a lot here today, Fred, and I think there's one last question that I kind of want to touch on, which I was going to cover at the start, but we've kind of got deviated and sidetracked, so it was a good conversation. But is the topic of the role of the board, or what was previously known as the council of the foundation. So maybe you could just give us a little bit of an update on that, or kind of thoughts.
Yeah. So around 14 months ago when I joined, there was a council, and how a Swiss foundation works is that there are certain things where the council is actually personally liable for. So it's very different than a limited liability company and so forth. So you actually have personal liability, which I think is one of the strong arguments for actually operating out of the Swiss foundation, because you have a good bridge between decentralization projects, but also, who's doing what with the foundation. You can't just say, oh, we're doing all this amazing stuff, but if somebody comes, we just run away and we're not there, right? So you have this substance, which is very, very key. And when I came, you had a fantastic council who was very engaged on a very operational level, down in the engine rooms, and they were also very engagingly, interacting with a lot of people in the community. And as we've seen during the year, what we've done is we've done a transformation, not just in terms of what is available on the Cardano stack and the maturity of the community, but also on the foundation. So we basically transformed an operational board of directors or council into being a more classical supervisory board. And we also had a look into the crystal ball and said, what kind of skills do we need in the next 2 years to really get a public permissionless blockchain as Cardano to really thrive? So what we were looking for there was, we were looking for somebody with very deep understanding in the US regulatory environment, because we see a lot of things is happening there. And I think with Mary Beth and her long experience as a US attorney and also experience in blockchain, we really got a person there who really understands the US regulatory landscape, but also is a part of it on a day-to-day basis in many ways. We were also thinking about audit and accountability and certification, so certified implementation providers and so forth. So we were really looking, could we find somebody who has been very deep into a Big Four or into the audit world and really been working around how do you audit technology and emerging technologies such as blockchain, AI, gene therapy and those kind of things. So we're very happy that we now have a person with over 20 years experience in technology audit and certifications. So he really can guide us on some of those questions around how far can we go as a foundation to really enter that space. And when we start thinking about having the blueprints on chain and having proper descriptions and ensuring that if you're putting a nation state on the Cardano blockchain and they need to have an audit oversight on that we actually have the processes and policies and the risk willingness to go in that direction. The other part is capital markets. Capital markets is one of the largest use cases. So we were looking for a Swiss-based capital markets professional. And we found Gillian McNabb, which is amazing because he's been through some of the largest and most well-known companies, and he's always been on the front edge of technology and operating models to really ensure that we never lose our base of operations in terms of getting access to an operating foundation, right? So foundation law and operations and access to the capital markets. So last but not least, Cardano as a project, as it's maturing and moving along and into Voltaire and so forth, it's extremely important for us that we had somebody with very deep experience in this open source environment. How do you incentivize and cultivate a project which has not just like the 16, 17 companies today who's contributing to the code base, but really, maybe hundreds and thousands of companies contributing to that. But on top of that, an engineer, and on top of that, somebody who works into blockchain. And now, the landscape becomes there's not a lot of those people out there. So we are really delighted to have Fernando Vasquez on board, who actually ticks all of those boxes with his long-range experience from the Linux Foundation and being a contributor there, with his engineering background and his deep knowledge as a CEO of a digital asset company and operator of several exchanges and so forth. I think this gives us really the last bit, which really is needed to look into 2022 and 2023 and helping us in the foundation as a supervisory function to really allow us to push the envelope of take more risk, to expose ourselves more into the ecosystem, to build products and really start to go into that journey of the next stages of the Cardano evolution.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, so I think we're actually coming to a conclusion. So I have one last question for you. We're going to make it a quick fire round. So give me 3 bullet points on the objectives for the Cardano Foundation for the next year.
3 bullet points.
3 bullet points.
Accountability, progress, and the establishment of actual infrastructure products which will allow the projects who's building a Cardano to scale, but also to feel that the infrastructure is way more reliable and it fits, large-scale adoption.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much.
What an amazing conversation. I'm already looking forward to the next set of questions. I'm looking forward to talking even more about 2022. Thank you for guiding me through this, Rena, and I wish you all a great day.